Hi friends and welcome back. Today's video is our July 2021 Patreon project, where I'll show you how to make basic apron dresses and work aprons for all your thread follower critters. I've also thrown into the pattern pages the bucket bag from my Ludwig Lionheart pattern. I love this bag, and when you zazz it up with some extra embellishments, it gets even better. Because the one-piece apron patterns are so straightforward, I'll mainly focus on techniques and embellishments in this video. I'll cover the basic assembly of each apron, stabilizing narrow straps, sewing in snaps, the buttonhole stitch, attaching heat set crystals, the chain stitch, the French knot, and a bit about some of the miniature hardware I'm using. As an extra bonus, I've put together 12 free packets, first come, first serve, for those of you who are ordering supplies from my Etsy shop. The packet includes bag hardware with 3 hooks, 6 rings, 6 bars, and 4 rare earth magnets. I've also included 6 heat set crystals for you to try out, and leather strips that you can use as bag straps or as the straps on the work apron. Make sure to say in your order that you would like one of July's bonus packs to be added in with your supplies, and we'll pop it right in for you. Okay, so here we have our aprons. The first one has a very basic embellishment with only heat set crystals. In the back, the straps cross, as you can see here, and you'll need one snap for the dress closure above the tail, and then another at either end of the straps so your animal can get in and out easily. Our second apron is the same basic design, but has patch pockets in the front. On the back, the straps come straight down and are stitched in, so there's no need for a snap closure. Now, you'll notice I haven't stitched the back seam down yet, and that's because we'll be doing that together a little bit later. In the third design, I shortened the length, and rather than having them built in, I made the straps from a contrasting velvet ribbon and added extra to trim the edge. I used die-cut flowers I found online and more heat-set crystals in the center of each flower. The fourth apron I made as a work apron. This one would be great as a craft apron, a cook's apron, or for something in the wood shop. Let's get started here with the patch pocket apron. The first thing that we're going to work on are the pockets. So I've got a little sample here, and I've got my thread knotted, and I'm just going to start my needle a little ways away from the edge so that that knot doesn't get in my way later. I'm using sort of a dark blue thread here so that we can see the stitches pretty well. The first thing that I'm going to do is do a little running stitch around the curved edge so that we have the same border on that edge as we'll have all the way around the pocket. When we come up to the top corner here, now I'm going to place I'll get one more stitch in there. Now I'm going to place the pocket on my little apron sample here. So I'm going to start by going through the yellow felt because that's where I was on my running stitch. And now I'm just going to continue that running stitch all the way around the pocket. So I'm just going to pop a little pin in there so the pocket stays in place as I keep going here. So you'll notice that I'm doing my whip stitches in 2 parts. I'm stitching from front to back and back to front. And the reason that I'm doing that is because it allows me to have a little bit more control over my stitches. If I was to do my stitches, say, in the way you might do hand quilting or sashiko, you might load several stitches on at the same time. And with those techniques, it works perfectly, but with the felt, the stitches that you make are not even on the front and the back, and you just don't have quite the same control. And so since this is such a, these are such small little things, the size of the stitches and the spacing, just looks a little bit more tidy if you do it this way. So when you get to the end of the pocket, I'm just going to make one last stitch here. When you get to the end of the pocket, you can just knot off on the back side. And this is a great way to do an ending knot where you make a loop and you pass your needle through it, and then you can draw the thread right down to the surface so your knot is nice and tight there. So there we go, we've got a little pocket, and you're just going to repeat this and do it for a left and a right pocket. So on the straps here, I just wanted to talk about stabilizing narrow pieces of felt. So narrow pieces of felt can easily break if you pull them. As you can see on this bag handle, I've done a buttonhole stitch on either side of the edge, and I've met each stitch in the center. And I love the way this looks, but it definitely takes some time to do. So I wanted to find a solution to stabilizing the felt without any stitching, and that's what I've done here. So what I found is that this fabric Mod Podge, make sure to get the fabric variety, that this stays sort of soft and pliable and rubbery after it's dried. And so what I did for these straps was just to take a little bit of the Mod Podge, and you can use a brush if you have it, but I'm just using my finger for this sample. So if you just, on the back side of the straps, before you stitch them down, if you just put a thin layer of this Mod Podge, then you'll be able to, your kids or whoever will be able to play with this dress and take it on and off, and those straps won't be as breakable. So I put a little bit right at the base here where it connects all the way down the strap. So let's just jump backwards here for a second. On my last sample, I got a little ahead of myself, and I didn't show you how to sew down the straps or sew on the first snap side. So let's do that on this sample. So what you want to do is try it on your animal at this point. And you're just going to fold the straps down on the back. Get those ears out of the way. And then you're going to start to wrap the back of the apron dress around. And then you're just going to pin the straps in place. Just like that, and then you can go ahead and take it off, and we'll stitch those straps down. So I have a single strand of thread knotted at one end here, and I'm just going to hold that in place. My pin's kind of in the way here, so I'm just going to take that out and hold it with my thumb and index finger and start whip stitching right around that edge. So as I'm whip stitching here, I'm just going through the surface of the felt so that none of my whip stitches will show on the front side of our apron. So when I get to the end here, I'm just going to slide my needle through, whoops, one more stitch, and then I'm going to slide my needle through to the other side of the strap so that I can be stitching in the right direction when I come to the front here. Got a little knot there. This is another one of those little slip knots. I can just pull it in the opposite direction and then pop it out. So now I'm going to do a whip stitch and go through the surface of the strap and stitch it to the edge of the apron there. Bring my thread to the back. And then I'm just going to move the end where my thread ends a little bit away from that edge so I don't have any knots showing at the edge there, and we can snip it off. I'll just do this other one off camera, and we'll move on to the snap. So we want to start with the nipple side of the snap. This is the slimmer side that has the raised bump on the surface, and that's the one that we're going to stitch on first. Take your snap and center it in the tab. You want to make sure it's on the wrong side of the apron dress. I have my needle threaded with a single strand of thread and knotted at one end. And I'm going to enter a little ways back from the snap and just go through the surface so I can pop that knot between the thickness of the felt, so it won't show on the front or the back. Now I'm entering the first hole here, and when I grab the felt, I'm just going to grab the surface of the felt as I stitch. So again, these stitches won't show on the front of the felt. Through each hole, I'll pass 3 to 4 times. When you're transitioning between holes, if you slide your needle below the snap through the surface of the felt and you exit just about where you need to be for your next hole, then you won't get that funny diagonal stitch. So now I'm going to make 3 to 4 more passes here. And I'm still in my second hole, so I'm still kind of fiddling around with the snap to make sure that it's secure and not sliding, you know, somewhere where it shouldn't be. Another thing that you can do is, I'm a little bit tangled here, let me get untangled, is slide through. If you're using a slim needle, you can actually slide through underneath and through the hole. If you're using a size 7 or an 8, it might not work, but a 9 or a 10, it probably will. So that's an alternative to going underneath the snap and not catching the hole. So now I'm going to make 3 or 4 more passes. Do you see what I'm doing with my pinky and ring finger? I'm grabbing the thread to keep it taut as I make each stitch. And it does get a little twisted. The thread definitely gets more twisted than usual when you're doing snaps, so you have to straighten it out every now and then. But I grab it like that to hold it taut, and it just makes it so that my stitches don't get all crisscrossed over each other and they look nice and clean on the snap. So I've gone around all 4, and now I'm just going to pass under the snap, make my knot, and then I can pass back under it one more time and kind of hide the knot underneath the snap. So that is it. You have a nice, cleanly stitched snap with no stitches showing on the other side. Oop, it looks like I might have 1 stitch showing on the other side, but that's not too bad. Okay, so now we're on to the other side of the snap. So this is the side that I'm calling the dimple side of the snap. This is definitely the thicker of the 2 sides. So even though we're all really familiar with snaps, it's really easy to sew these on backwards, so just keep an eye out for that. So you can see here that I've stitched on the other strap off camera, and now we are ready to try on the apron onto our animal and fit the second snap. So I'm just putting this onto my rabbit here, sliding the sleeves over, keeping the ears out of the way. Okay, so I'm just going to cross the back here so that it fits nicely. And I'm pressing that nipple side of the snap into the felt to create a little indentation. I'm just going to mark it with a pencil so it doesn't smooth out as I take the apron back off again. Sometimes I don't mark it, but I thought for today, just since we were all looking at it, it would be a better visual. Now, I've got my needle threaded with a single strand of thread, and I'm going to bring my needle up just above my marking. And that's because I want the center of the snap to be where the marking is, and I want my thread to come out where the first hole is. So I'm going to pass my needle from front to back to make each stitch instead of making the front and back stitch all in one pass like we did on the nipple side of the snap. So this is going to give me a nice clean finish to the snap stitching here. Because this side of the snap is thicker, it's easier to sew in this way where you're making 2 passes. And I also reserve this side of the snap. I always use it for the underside, while the nipple side is the sort of outer part of the flap. That way the stitches from this can be visible on the inside of the garment, while on the slimmer nipple side of the snap, I can make them invisible on the outside. Great, so now with our snap closure done, we are ready to work on the back seam under the tail hole. So go ahead and thread your needle with a single strand of thread and knot one end. And then make a whip stitch down the back seam of the apron dress. As usual, I'm using about a 1/16 of an inch seam allowance for the whip stitch here. And when you get to the end of the seam, go ahead and knot off, and there's no need to hide your knots here because everything will be hidden on the inside of the apron dress. So that's it for the basic construction. Just go ahead and turn the dress and it's ready to go. Let's take a look at the version that crosses in the back with the heat set crystals next. So you can see I've ironed on the heat set crystals to the bottom hem, neckline, and straps, and I've stabilized the underside of the straps with Mod Podge again. The straps have to be longer on this one to cross in the back. And to get in and out easily, you need snaps or maybe hooks and rings on either side of the waist closure. To make the strap stitching easier, I left the bottom bit of the straps free of crystals. I've made the straps just wide enough to fit a 6mm snap. Go ahead and stitch the nipple side of the snap to the strap ends and wrap the thread right around the strap edges. To attach the heat set crystals, turn your iron onto its high setting and press to flatten the felt surface. Scraggly wool fibers prevent the crystals from behaving and sitting flat, so it's a good idea to flatten it first. I'm using a pair of bent end needle nose pliers to place the crystals, but you can use regular needle nose pliers or any tweezers you have around the house. So I'm just going to go ahead and demonstrate on this scrap piece of felt, and I think I'll put together a little cross shape here with the crystals. So when I have my crystals in place, I'm ready to heat set them to the felt, and my iron is still on high here. You don't want them to shift when you heat them, so set the iron onto the surface gently, and then press firmly without moving your iron for 8 to 10 seconds. Then, when you're ready, you can lift the iron. If any of the crystals have moved, you can quickly shift them with the pliers while they're still hot. The crystals get quite hot and take a few minutes to cool off, so watch out for that as you work. You can work in small sections and reheat what you've already done, so don't worry about getting it all in one go. So next up is the one with the add-on straps and these cute little die-cut flowers. I've attached the velvet straps to the front and the back of the apron, just like we did with the patch pocket apron. And then for the velvet edge in the front, I just used tacky glue to attach that, making sure that I got a bit at either end to seal it off from fraying. For the flowers, I stitched each one with a few stitches in its center. I think tacky glue would work here though, if you wanted to go that route. And then I heat set a crystal in the center of each flower. For a nice trim on the bottom hem, I made a buttonhole stitch along its edge. I've used this in several of the bags as well, so I'll show you how to do that next. So I have a bit of sample felt again to demonstrate the stitch, and I've threaded my needle with 2 strands of thread. You can do this with any thickness of thread, of course, but I usually do 1 strand for fine stitching and 2 for bolder color on small scale items like this. The buttonhole stitch is made much like a whip stitch, but at the end of each whip around the felt edge, you pass the needle through the back side of the loop. By doing this, you create a small twist in the thread, and that locks the stitch in place. And it also makes a connection between each stitch along the edge of the felt. So I use the buttonhole stitch as a decorative stitch on clothing and bags, and it's great to stabilize narrow straps as well if you have some patience for extra fiddly work. So next up is the French knot. I've used it here in white around the outer edge of the circular pattern and in a cluster in the center of the magnetic closure. On the bag, I made the knots with 2-strand threads, but I'll demonstrate with 3 strands for clarity since these little guys are so small. So what you want to do is come up from the back side of the fabric. And because my piece is so small here, I'll just pin it to my work surface as I make each knot. Now at this point, I want you to pay close attention to the way that I wrap the thread around the needle. This is important because if you wrap it in the wrong direction, it won't make a knot. With one wrap and a single thread, you'll have a super micro knot, whereas with 3 strands and 4 wraps, as I'm doing here, you'll get something much more substantial. So our next move in the French knot is to bring the point of the needle down to the felt like this. Insert the point just to the side and very close to where your thread exited before you began wrapping the needle. For beginners, I like to leave the thread somewhat loose around the needle. This makes pulling the thread through the wraps much easier. When the needle is through, but not pulled all the way, you can tighten the wraps on the thread instead of on the needle. Then, you can pull the thread the rest of the way through to form a perfectly round ball on the surface. Okay, so we are on to the chain stitch. This is our next and last stitch of the project, and then we'll move on to hardware after this. So let's take a look at this little bag that I've used the chain stitch on. It has this nice little starburst pattern on the front of it. Okay, so for the chain stitch, I've got my needle threaded and knotted with 3 strands of thread here, just so that you can see a nice bold pattern. But on the bags, I've used something quite a bit finer, like 1 or 2 strands. So what you want to do is pull your thread through, like I've done there, and then you see how I have that little loop that I've created? I'm making a loop around the needle. Let's do that one more time, and then the thread is catching that loop. So I'm going to go now through the loop I just made next to where I exited and make the second link in the chain. And again, I go through the previous link and make another link like that. I love this stitch. It's really quite simple, and once you get used to it, it moves along very fast, and it works much better on a slightly bigger piece of felt. But I guess all the bags we're working on are very small anyway, so better get used to it. So then to end off your chain stitch, what you're going to do is just make a stitch at the end of your loop that tacks the link down. And that's it. And then you can make single chain stitches, and this stitch is called a lazy daisy. And these guys are just a single link that you lock down with that ending stitch. So there we go, there's my little locking stitch that ends off the little petal of the flower. And then you can kind of spiral them out like this to create petals on a flower. Or I often do like 3 of them at angles like this. They make something that looks a little bit like a fleur-de-lis or something like that on the back of a jacket. And you can separate them like I'm doing here, or you can really put them right next to each other and connect the bases of them too. So that is really it for the chain stitch. And then our last 2 things are to take a quick peek at the work apron, which is super simple, and then some bag hardware. So let's take a look at our little work apron here on Calvin Cat. So this is a really simple one. So there's no back seam to stitch. All we have is a snap closure here. And then if you can see on the side here, I've used the bar side of a hook and bar to send the strap through so it can tie in the front. So I've got one of those on either side of the apron. And then I've used another one here on his paw so he can hold on to this little hard screwdriver there. And then he has a little patch pocket with a running stitch, so you can apply that the same way that we did the patch pockets on our first apron. And then to get the leather through the felt, I use this big eye needle with a nice point. And so that's all you do is you thread the felt, thread the leather or whatever strap you're using through the front and tie a little knot. And that is it for the work apron. Now let's take a look at some of the hardware on these bags. So on this one I have a little hook on the side of the bag and a ring on both sides of the strap. And that's because some of the animals have sort of a big head and it's hard to get the bags over them. And on the front here I've used some tiny rare earth magnets, which I've listed in the Patreon post so that you can order some of those. Now on this other bag, I wanted to show you, these are those little lobster clips. It's a jewelry finding, and I've used those for handles on this bag, which I think is super cute. And then this is another bag with the hook and ring style, but I've used leather strap instead. So I made a little hole in the center of the strap, and I just stitched around on either side to make it easier. And on this one I've used a linen cording for the closure, which I thought was kind of fun as well. And you can see each of these closures is slightly different, just varying ways of attaching them. You can decide what you like for the bag that you're making. So there they are, some cute little bags to go with your aprons. So that's it for now. I'll see you again next month with another project. Have fun and happy stitching.